Pickett's charge was an infantry assault ordered by Confederate Gen.Robert E.Lee against Maj.Gen. George G. Meade's Union positions on Cemetery Ridge on July 3, 1863, the last day of the Battle of Gettysburg in the state of Pennsylvania during the American Civil War. Its futility was predicted by the charge's commander, Lt. Gen. James Longstreet, and it was arguably an avoidable mistake from which the Southern war effort never fully recovered militarily or psychologically. The farthest point reached by the attack has been referred to as the high water mark of the Confederacy. The charge is named after Maj.Gen. George Pickett, one of 3 Confederate generals who led the assault under Longstreet. After Confederate attacks on both Union flanks had failed the day and night before, Lee was determined to strike the Union center on the 3rd day. On the night of July 2, Meade correctly predicted at a council of war that Lee would try an attack on his lines in the center the following morning. The infantry assault was preceded by a massive artillery bombardment that was meant to soften up the Union defense and silence its artillery, but was largely ineffective. Approximately 12,500 men in 9 infantry brigades advanced over open fields for 3/4 of a mile under heavy Union artillery and rifle fire. Although some Confederates were able to breach the low stone wall that shielded many of the Union defenders, they could not maintain the hold and were repulsed with over 50% casualties, a decisive defeat that ended the 3-day battle and Lee's campaign into Pennsylvania. Years later, when asked why his charge at Gettysburg failed, Pickett replied, "I've always thought the Yankees had something to do with it." Background: military situation, opposing forces, Union-Confederate plans and command structures. Pickett's charge was planned for 3 Confederate divisions, commanded by Maj.Gen. George Pickett, Brig. Gen. J. Johnston Pettigrew, and Maj.Gen. Isaac R. Trimble, consisting of troops from Lt. Gen. James Longstreet's 1st Corps and Lt. Gen. A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps. Pettigrew commanded brigades from Maj.Gen. Henry Heth's old division under Col. Burkett D. Fry, Col. James K. Marshall, Brig. Gen. Joseph R. Davis, and Col. John M. Brockenborough. Trimble, commanding Maj.Gen. Dorsey Pender's division, had the brigades of Brig. Gens. Alfred M. Scales and James H. Lane. 2 brigades from Maj.Gen. Richard H. Anderson's division were to support the attack on the right flank. Brig. Gen. Cadmus M. Wilcox and Col. David Lang. The target of the Confederate assault was the center of the Union Army of the Potomac's 2nd Corps, commanded by Maj.Gen. Winfield S. Hancock. Directly in the center was the division of Brig. Gen. John Gibbon with the brigades of Brig. Gen. William Harrow, Col. Norman J. Hall, and Brig. Gen. Alexander S. Webb. To the north of this position were brigades from the division of Brig. Gen. Alexander Hayes, and to the south was Maj.Gen. Abner Doubleday's division of the 1st Corps, including the 2nd Vermont Brigade of Brig. Gen. George J. Stannard and the 121st Pennsylvania under the command of Col. Chapman Biddle. Meade's headquarters were just behind the 2nd Corps line, in the small house owned by the widow Lydia Leicester. The specific objective of the assault has been the source of historical controversy. Traditionally, the copse of trees on Cemetery Ridge has been cited as the visual landmark for the attacking force. Historical treatments such as the 1993 film Gettysburg continue to popularize this view, which originated in the work of Gettysburg battlefield historian John B. Batchelder in the 1880s. However, recent scholarship, including published works by some Gettysburg National Military Park historians, has suggested that Lee's goal was actually Ziegler's Grove on Cemetery Hill. a more prominent and highly visible grouping of trees about 300 yards north of the copse. The much-debated theory suggests that Lee's general plan for the second-day attacks had not changed on the third day, and the attacks on July 3 were also aimed at securing the hill and the network of roads it commanded. The copse of trees, currently a prominent landmark, was under 10 feet high in 1863, only visible to a portion of the attacking columns from certain parts of the battlefield. For the beginning of the planning, things went awry for the Confederates. While Pickett's division had not been used yet at Gettysburg, A.P. Hill's health became an issue and he did not participate in selecting which of his troops were to be used for the charge. Some of Hill's corps had fought lightly on July 1 and not at all on July 2. However, troops that had done heavy fighting on July 1 ended up making the charge. Although the assault is known to popular history as Pickett's charge, overall command was given to James Longstreet, and Pickett was one of his divisional commanders. Lee did tell Longstreet that Pickett's fresh division should lead the assault, so the name is appropriate, although some recent historians have used the name Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble assault to more fairly distribute the credit. With Hill sidelined, Pettigrew's and Trimble's divisions were delegated to Longstreet's authority as well. Thus, Pickett's name has been lent to a charge in which he commanded 3 out of the 11 brigades while under the supervision of his corps commander. Throughout, Pickett's men were almost exclusively from Virginia, with the other divisions consisting of troops from North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee. The supporting troops under Wilcox and Lang were from Alabama and Florida. In conjunction with the infantry assault, Lee planned a cavalry action in the Union rear. Maj.Gen. J.B. Stuart led his cavalry division to the east, prepared to exploit Lee's hoped-for breakthrough by attacking the Union rear and disrupting its line of communications along the Baltimore Pike. Despite Lee's hope for an early start, it took all morning to arrange the infantry assault force. Neither Lee's nor Longstreet's headquarters sent orders to Pickett to have his division on the battlefield by daylight. Historian Jeffrey D. Wirt blames this oversight on Longstreet, describing it either as a misunderstanding of Lee's verbal order or a mistake. Some of the many criticisms of Longstreet's Gettysburg performance by the postbellum Lost Cause authors cite this failure as evidence that Longstreet deliberately undermined Lee's plan for the battle. Meanwhile, on the far right end of the Union line, a 7-hour battle raged for the control of Culp's Hill. Lee's intent was to synchronize his offensive across the battlefield, keeping Meade from concentrating his numerically superior force. But the assaults were poorly coordinated and Maj.Gen. Edward Allegheny Johnson's attacks against Culp's Hill petered out just as Longstreet's cannonade began. Artillery barrage. The infantry charge was preceded by what Lee hoped would be a powerful and well-concentrated cannonade of the Union center, destroying the Union artillery batteries that could defeat the assault and demoralizing the Union infantry. But a combination of inept artillery leadership and defective equipment doomed the barrage from the beginning. Longstreet's corps artillery chief, Col. Edward Porter Alexander, had effective command of the field. Lee's artillery chief, Brig.Gen. William N. Pendleton, played little role other than to obstruct the effective placement of artillery from the other two corps. Despite Alexander's efforts, then, there was insufficient concentration of Confederate fire on the objective. The July 3 bombardment was likely the largest of the war, with hundreds of cannons from both sides firing along the lines for 1 to 2 hours. Starting around 1 p.m., Confederate guns numbered between 150 and 170 and fired from a line over 2 miles long, starting in the south at the Peach Orchard and running roughly parallel to the Emmetsburg Road. Confederate Brig.Gen. Vander wrote, "The cannonade in the center presented one of the most magnificent battle scenes witnessed during the war. Looking up the valley towards Gettysburg, the hills on either side were capped with crowns of flame and smoke, as 300 guns, about equally divided between the two ridges, vomited their iron hail upon each other. Despite its ferocity, the fire was mostly ineffectual. Confederate shells often overshot the infantry front lines, in some cases because of inferior shell fuses that delayed detonation, and the smoke covering the battlefield concealed that fact from the gunners." Union Artillery Chief Brig.Gen. Henry J. Hunt had only about 80 guns available to conduct counter-battery fire. The geographic features of the Union line had limited areas for effective gun emplacement. He also ordered that firing cease to conserve ammunition, but to fool Alexander, Hunt ordered his cannons to cease fire slowly to create the illusion that they were being destroyed one by one. By the time all of Hunt's cannons ceased fire, and still blinded by the smoke from battle, Alexander fell for Hunt's deception and believed that many of the Union batteries had been destroyed. Hunt had to resist the strong arguments of Hancock, who demanded Union fire to lift the spirits of the infantrymen pinned down by Alexander's bombardment. Even Meade was affected by the artillery. The Leicester House was a victim of frequent overshots, and he had to evacuate with his staff to Powers Hill. The day was hot, 87 degrees Fahrenheit by one account, and humid, and the Confederates suffered under the hot sun and from the Union counter-battery fire as they awaited the order to advance. When Union cannoneers overshot their targets, they often hit the massed infantry waiting in the woods of Seminary Ridge or in the shallow depressions just behind Alexander's guns, causing significant casualties before the charge began. Longstreet had opposed the charge from the beginning, convinced the charge would fail, and had his own plan that he would have preferred for a strategic movement around the Union left flank. He claimed to have told Lee, "General, I have been a soldier all my life. I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know, as well as anyone, what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take the position." Longstreet wanted to avoid personally ordering the charge by attempting to pass the mantle on to young Colonel Alexander, telling him that he should inform Pickett at the optimum time to begin the advance. Based on his assessment that the Union artillery had been effectively silenced, although he had insufficient information to accomplish this, Alexander eventually notified Pickett that he was running dangerously short of ammunition, sending the message, "If you are coming at all, come at once, or I cannot give you proper support." But the enemy's fire has not slackened at all. At least 18 guns are still firing from the cemetery itself. Pickett asked Longstreet, "General, shall I advance?" Longstreet's memoir recalled the effort to speak. "The order failed, and I could only indicate it by an affirmative bow." Longstreet made one final attempt to call off the assault. After his encounter with Pickett, he discussed the artillery situation with Porter and was informed that Porter did not have full confidence that all the enemy's guns were silenced, and that the Confederate ammunition was almost exhausted. Longstreet ordered Porter to stop Pickett, but the young colonel explained that replenishing his ammunition from the trains in the rear would take over an hour, and this delay would nullify any advantage the previous barrage had given them. The infantry assault went forward without the Confederate artillery close support that had been originally planned. Infantry assault. The entire force that stepped off toward the Union positions at about 2 p. consisted of about 12,500 men. Although the attack is popularly called a charge, the men marched deliberately in line, to speed up and then charge only when they were within a few hundred yards of the enemy. The line consisted of Pettigrew and Trimble on the left, and Pickett to the right. The 9 brigades of men stretched over a mile-long front. The Confederates encountered heavy artillery fire while advancing nearly 3/4 of a mile across open fields to reach the Union line, and were slowed by fences in the path. Initially sloping down, the terrain changed to a gentle upward incline approximately midway between the lines. These obstacles played a large role in the increasing number of casualties the advancing Confederates faced. The ground between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge is slightly undulating, and the advancing troops periodically disappeared from the view of the Union cannoneers. As the 3 Confederate divisions advanced, awaiting Union soldiers began shouting, "Fredericksburg! Fredericksburg! Fredericksburg!" in reference to the disastrous Union advance on the Confederate line during the 1862 Battle of Fredericksburg. Fire from Lt. Col. Freeman McGilvery's concealed artillery positions north of Little Round Top raked the Confederate right flank, while the artillery fire from Cemetery Hill hit the left. Shell and solid shot in the beginning turned to canister and musket fire as the Confederates came within 400 yards of the Union line. The mile-long front shrank to less than half a mile as the men filled in gaps that appeared throughout the line and followed the natural tendency to move away from the flanking fire. On the left flank of the attack, Brockenborough's brigade was devastated by artillery fire from Cemetery Hill. They were also subjected to a surprise musket fusillade from the 8th Ohio Infantry Regiment, the 160 Ohioans, firing from a single line. So surprised Brockenborough's Virginians, already demoralized by the losses to artillery fire, that they panicked and fled back to Seminary Ridge, crashing through Trimble's division and causing many of his men to bolt as well. The Ohioans followed up with a successful flanking attack on Davis's brigade of Mississippians and North Carolinians, which was now the left flank of Pettigrew's division. The survivors were subjected to increasing artillery fire from Cemetery Hill. More than 1,600 rounds were fired at Pettigrew's men during the assault. This portion of the assault never advanced much farther than the sturdy fence at the Emmetsburg Road. By this time, the Confederates were close enough to be fired on by artillery canister, and Alexander Hayes' division unleashed very effective musketry fire from behind 260 yards of stone wall, with every rifleman of the division lined up as many as 4 deep, exchanging places in line as they fired and then fell back to reload. Trimble's division of 2 brigades followed Pettigrew's, but made poor progress. Confusing orders from Trimble caused Lane to send only 3½ of his North Carolina regiments forward. Renewed fire from the 8th Ohio and the onslaught of Hayes's riflemen prevented most of these men from getting past the Emmetsburg Road. Scales's North Carolina brigade, led by Col. William L. J. Lawrence, started with a heavier disadvantage. They had lost almost 2/3 of the men on July 1. They were also driven back and Lawrence was wounded. The Union defenders also took casualties, but Hayes encouraged his men by riding back and forth just behind the battle line, shouting, "Hurrah, boys, we're giving them hell." 2 horses were shot out from under him. Historian Stephen W. Sears calls Hayes's performance inspiring. On the right flank, Pickett's Virginians crossed the Emmetsburg Road and wheeled partially to the left to face northeast. They marched in 2 lines, led by the brigades of Brig. Gen. James L. Kemper on the right and Brig. Gen. Richard B. Garnett on the left. Brig.Gen. Louis A. Armistead's brigade followed closely behind. As the division wheeled to the left, its right flank was exposed to McGilvery's guns in the front of Doubleday's Union Division on Cemetery Ridge. Stannard's Vermont Brigade marched forward, faced north, and delivered withering fire into the rear of Kemper's brigade. At about this time, Hancock, who had been prominent in displaying himself on horseback to his men during the Confederate artillery bombardment, was wounded by a bullet striking the pommel of his saddle, entering his inner right thigh along with wood fragments and a large bent nail. He refused evacuation to the rear until the battle was settled. As Pickett's men advanced, they withstood the defensive fire of first Stannard's brigade, then Harrow's, and then Hall's, before approaching a minor salient in the Union center, a low stone wall taking an 80-yard right-angle turn known afterward as the Angle. Quote, "It was defended by Brig.Gen. Alexander S. Webb's Philadelphia Brigade. Webb placed the two remaining guns of Lt. Alonzo Cushing's Battery A, 4th U.S. Artillery, at the front of his line at the stone fence, with the 69th and 71st Pennsylvania regiments of his brigade to defend the fence and the guns. The two guns and 940 men could not match the massive firepower that Ace's division, to the right, had been able to unleash. Two gaps opened up in the Union line. The commander of the 71st Pennsylvania ordered his men to retreat when the Confederates came too close to the Angle, south of the copse of trees. The men of the 59th New York inexplicably bolted for the rear. In the latter case, this left Captain Andrew Cowan and his 1st New York Independent Artillery Battery to face the oncoming infantry. Assisted personally by Artillery Chief Henry Hunt, Cowan ordered 5 guns to fire a double canister simultaneously. The entire Confederate line to his front disappeared. The gap vacated by most of the 71st Pennsylvania, however, was more serious, leaving only a handful of the 71st, 268 men of the 69th Pennsylvania, and Cushing's two 3-inch rifled guns to receive the 2,500 to 3,000 men of Garnett's and Armistead's brigades as they began to cross the stone fence. The Irishmen of the 69th Pennsylvania resisted fiercely in a melee of rifle fire, bayonets, and fists. Webb, mortified that the 71st had retreated, attempted to bring the 72nd Pennsylvania forward, but for some reason they did not obey the order, so he had to bring other regiments in to help fill the gap. During the fight, Lt. Cushing was killed as he shouted to his men, 3 bullets striking him, the third in his mouth. The Confederates seized his 2 guns and turned them to face the Union troops, but they had no ammunition to fire. As more Union reinforcements arrived and charged into the breach, the defensive line became impregnable and the Confederates began to slip away individually, with no senior officers remaining to call a formal retreat. The infantry assault lasted less than an hour. The supporting attack by Wilcox and Lang on Pickett's right was never a factor. They did not approach the Union line until after Pickett was defeated, and their advance was quickly broken up by McGilvery's guns and by the Vermont Brigade.